Hugo, an orphaned youngster, lives in the walls of the Gare Montparnasse railway station in Paris in the 1930s. By peering through the holes in the large clocks, he can observe all of the individuals that work at the station, including Inspector Gustave and his dog. Gustave has a weak leg that requires him to walk with a brace, and he's obsessed with catching criminals, particularly youngsters, to put to an institution. There's also Labisse, the owner of the bookshop, Lisette, the florist Gustave has a thing on, and Georges, the toy maker, who is occasionally visited by his goddaughter Isabelle. Hugo realizes Georges has fallen asleep one morning and attempts to steal a clockwork mouse from him. Georges, on the other hand, was simply acting and caught Hugo in the act. Knowing the youngster has been stealing from him for some time, he makes Hugo empty his pockets, displaying all the clockwork components from the toys he's stolen as well as an odd tiny notepad. Georges opens it and is impressed by Hugo's notes on clockwork, but he becomes terrified when he discovers pictures of an automaton. He doesn't trust Hugo when he insists he didn't steal the notebook and dismisses him as a thief. Hugo refuses to leave without the notebook, but when Gustave hears the term thief, he starts following Hugo with his dog. They sprint through the entire station, and Hugo eventually loses them by climbing on a roof platform, while Gustave's leg brace becomes trapped on a train door. Hugo then returns to his house within the walls to keep the station clocks running and people observing. When Georges shuts his business for the day, Hugo returns to ask for his notebook, but Georges swears to burn it. Hugo chooses to follow Georges all the way home, only to be abandoned outside. When he notices Isabelle at the window, he asks for her assistance, and she comes out to listen to his story. Isabelle pledges to retrieve the journal since she enjoys the concept of secrets and adventures, but Hugo must return home before they are discovered. Hugo cries as he glances at the automaton from the drawings when he arrives home. Hugo's widower father and clockworker, Mr. Cabret, discovered an abandoned automaton in the attic of the museum where he worked. Hugo and Mr. Cabret worked hard to repair the automaton while learning the profession, but they couldn't get it to work without the heart key that was missing on its back. Hugo was forced to live with his drunken Uncle Claude after Mr. Cabret died in a fire one night, and all he managed to take with him was the automaton and the journal in which they tracked their progress. Instead of sending Hugo to school, Claude taught him how to take care of the station clocks. Soon after, Claude vanished, but Hugo kept the clocks running in order to reside in Claude's chamber without anyone discovering. To subsist, he stole food from the station stores while avoiding Gustave at all costs. Hugo returns to see Georges the next day, but this time he is given the ashes of the burned notebook. Hugo flees in tears, only to run into Isabelle, who has something to tell him privately and draws him inside the bookstore. Isabelle tells Hugo, after seeing Labisse, that Georges did not burn the notepad and that it was all a ruse. She also describes how the diary distressed him to the point of crying, and her advice is to try again while being consistent. Hugo returns to see Georges and refuses to leave, so Georges decides to put him to the test. Hugo is sent to repair a clockwork mouse and impresses Georges with his speed, so he is hired as an apprentice. Hugo must now labor at the shop to make up for all of the parts he stole, and Georges will determine when he has done enough to earn the notebook back. Georges shows him how to make clockwork gadgets, toys, and even a few magic tricks. All of this knowledge aids him in repairing the automaton, but he still requires the heart key to make it work. Hugo spends his free time watching Gustave catch kids and hanging out with Isabelle. Hugo sneaks her to the theater by sneaking through the back door, which he lockpicks with one of his tools, when she says she's never seen a movie since Georges won't let her. The youngsters have a lot of fun watching the movie, especially when a man hangs from a giant clock, but they get caught and kicked out before the finish. Hugo tells Isabelle on the way back to the station about all the movies Mr. Cabret would take him to, such as a trip to the moon, which featured a rocket landing on the moon's face. He also admits to living within the station's confines. Gustave stops them as they approach the station to check on Hugo, and Isabelle pretends he's her stupid cousin from the country. The dog is suspicious of Hugo's odor, but Isabelle says that it must be her cat's odor, and Gustave lets them go. Following that, Isabelle requests to see Hugo's house in the walls, but he refuses and attempts to lose her in the crowd. Isabelle, who isn't used to crowds, almost gets trampled, so Hugo returns to save her and realizes her necklace contains the heart key. Hugo agrees to reveal Isabelle his secret and takes her to his chamber, where he borrows the key to start the automaton. It works, thankfully, however the robot just writes a few meaningless lines. Hugo sobs, believing he could have mended it and wanting it could have a message from his father, when the automaton resumes its work. It's a drawing of a scene from A Trip to the Moon, signed by Georges Méliès, which Isabelle recognizes as her godfather's complete name. The children travel to Isabelle's house to speak with Georges' wife Jean about the automaton and show her the artwork. This irritates Jean, who advises them not to delve into the past because they are too young to comprehend it. When Georges returns, Jean hides the children in her chamber. Hugo searches for his notes in the wardrobe and notices a concealed compartment with a box within. Isabelle, being taller, takes the box out by standing on a chair, but the chair breaks and the box falls, revealing a collection of exquisite illustrations, including A Trip to the Moon. When Georges hears this, he comes to check on them and discovers his work all over the floor. This drives him to have a nervous breakdown, as he realizes he is nothing more than a destitute merchant. He also accuses Hugo of being cruel for betraying his confidence in this manner. Hugo arrives to the station, where he encounters Labisse, who is holding some books. Hugo's interest in Robin Hood Le Proscrit is seen by the guy because he used to read it with his father, so Labisse decides to offer him the book because it appears it was intended for him. Meanwhile, Gustave attempts to strike up a discussion with Lisette, but he is embarrassed by his leg, which never healed following a war mishap. Lisette, on the other hand, does not criticize him. In fact, she admits that she lost her brother during the war. She sends Gustave a bouquet of flowers to express her condolences. The following day, Labisse instructs Hugo and Isabelle to go to the Film Academy library to obtain the information they require. A book called The Invention of Dreams claims Georges was one of the earliest filmmakers and a huge success, having filmed over 500 films, but it also claims he perished during World War I. René, the book's author, interrupts the youngsters' reading because he is overjoyed to learn that Georges is still alive. He leads them to see his private collection, saying how he's been a fan of Georges since he was a child and got to visit the set while his brother worked there. Nobody knows why Georges quit creating movies, but René possesses the lone film that has survived amid his collection of artifacts. Later, Isabelle and Hugo discuss a planned concept while he keeps the clocks running. Hugo believes that everyone, like machines, has a function, so perhaps that's why Georges is always sad, he's lost his purpose, and it's up to the kids to restore him. Isabelle kisses Hugo on the cheek before leaving. Hugo discovers the heart key on the train rails the next day and walks down to retrieve it, not realizing the train is approaching at the same time. The locomotive operators are unable to stop the train in time, and the entire vehicle crashes into the station walls. Hugo then awakens, realizing it was all a dream, only to discover his body is transforming into an automaton, which is also a dream. The following morning, Claude's body is discovered in the river, and he appears to have been dead for some time. The authorities alert Gustave, who is now obsessed with discovering who has been keeping the clocks running. Later that evening, Hugo and René deliver Georges' final film to his home. Jean attempts to kick them out before Georges sees them, but René recognizes her as one of Georges' movie actors and compliments her on her abilities. Overwhelmed by nostalgia and amazed that the film is still available, Jean agrees to let them watch it in the living room while Georges sleeps. The picture turns out to be A Trip to the Moon, with a few color segments. Jean reveals that they colored the film by hand painting each frame. Georges enters the room unexpectedly, having been awakened by the sound of his own movie projector. Jean points out that avoiding the past has only made him unhappy, and that it is now time to recollect, pushing Georges to finally reveal his story. He used to be a magician, with Jean as his assistant, and he was so successful that he owned his own theatre. He also enjoyed experimenting with devices, and he had his own workshop in his theatre where he created new illusions, which is how the automaton was created. When the Lumiere brothers first presented a film, Georges was captivated and determined to make his own camera out of scraps from the automaton. They decide to take a chance and sell the theatre in order to create their own film studio, where they make fantasies come true. Unfortunately, after many years of achievement, war struck and caused him to declare bankruptcy. Georges destroyed all the sets and costumes one night in desperation. The movies were all sold to a business that melted them down into chemicals needed to produce shoe heels, and the remaining money was used to purchase the toy shop. The only thing he couldn't bear destroying was the automaton, which he donated to a museum in the hopes that it might find a new home. Georges believes that the automaton was destroyed by the same fire that murdered Mr. Cabret and that happy endings only happen in movies. Hugo rushes back to the station to retrieve the automaton, but he comes to a halt when he overhears Gustave discussing Claude's death. Unfortunately, a shopkeeper's dog approaches Hugo and warns Gustave to his presence, resulting in Hugo being apprehended and imprisoned up in Gustave's office. The inspector contacts the orphanage and requests that Hugo be sent there, stating that he, too, attended one and was trained to follow commands and thrive without a family because you don't need one. Hugo lockpicks the cell door and flees to hide in the station walls while he is on the phone. In his haste, he forgets to close the lid behind him, and when Gustave follows him, he also manages to inside the walls. Hugo chooses to follow the movie he saw with Isabelle and climbs out of the building through the huge clock in order to escape Gustave. Gustave falls for the ruse and believes Hugo went down another corridor, and once he's gone, Hugo returns to get the automaton. Gustave finds him again on his way out and causes him to drop the automaton on the rails, so Hugo dives in to get it. A train is approaching that cannot be stopped, but Gustave grabs Hugo and takes him off the tracks. The inspector continues to ignore Hugo's pleadings and plans to take him to the orphanage, but his plans are thwarted when Georges appears and claims Hugo as his. A few weeks later, René hosts a banquet to honor Georges, who has been designated a professor at the Film Academy. They've recovered some old negatives and degraded film thanks to a hunt through vaults, private collections, barns, and catacombs, and they now have 80 of Georges' films to exhibit. During the after-party, it is revealed that Gustave is dating Lisette, and his leg now has a much superior clockwork-based brace made by Hugo, who is doing some magic shows for all the guests. Finally, Isabelle has discovered her calling as a writer, and she intends to begin with writing Hugo's narrative.